Okay, welcome back. Let's talk about aggregate supply now. We talked about aggregate demand in the first video. Second video, let's talk about aggregate supply. Now, as you recall from lecture, there's a time epoch that we consider when talking about aggregate supply. So that we end up breaking an aggregate supply down to short-run aggregate supply and long-run aggregate supply. In the short run, and primarily the reason we do that, right, is because there's certain constraints that exist in the short run, things like labor contracts or rental agreements or things like that that constrain short run aggregate supply in a way that long run is not. Generally speaking, short run aggregate supply is upward sloping and looks like this. Long run aggregate supply is a fixed amount in is perfectly vertical, and we'll get back to long run here in a minute. But in the short run, short run aggregate supply is generally upward sloping. Again, just like in aggregate demand, this becomes price level, and this becomes quantity of real GDP. Now, let's talk briefly. So again, it's a direct relationship. So as price level increases, right? So we have a certain price level, P1, that corresponds to a quantity of real GDP. And then as price level increases, so we'll go P2 up here, Q2 right there. It's a little messy, sorry. But you can see that a greater quantity of real GDP is associated with an increase in price level. And recall that an increase in price level, right, is essentially the definition of inflation, right? Okay, let's talk about a few things that will cause short-run aggregate supply to shift around a little bit. The main thing to think about and to understand is it's really input costs, right? So if you're a business and anything that causes your input costs to rise is going to effectively affect your profit and will cause short-run aggregate supply. If input costs increase, then your short-run aggregate supply will shift to the left. If your your input costs decrease, right, and your profit increases, then short-run aggregate supply will shift to the right. And again, that's not a profit of a single firm, but profitability, across all firms within the economy. There's also supply shocks that can shift short-run aggregate supply around. So, short-run aggregate supply. Now, let's talk about. I'm going to keep the same graph here, and let's talk about long run. So in your long run aggregate supply, try to make it not messy. All right, so long run aggregate supply really is the potential, right? It's the full employment GDP, or in other words, the amount of output that could be created at full employment. Which is, if you recall from our discussions on unemployment, full employment is, there's some amount of structural, some amount of frictional, but cyclical unemployment is zero. So at full employment, in theory, all those, employed workers could create a single or fixed amount of output, which is why that's a vertical line, because this then becomes a fixed quantity of real output, and by, de facto is the potential or the target for what the economy could and should be operating at. Okay, so let's end this video, and in the next video, we'll put it all together.